Stan, it's a pleasure to have you here back in Argentina and in our program too. Welcome to our country.
Thank you for having me. Wonderful memories of our previous interviews.
Okay, thank you. Tell us, we are all undergoing like a huge global crisis. How can you, or what can you tell us about what you think it's happening, or the problems, or the...
Well, I think we all agree that that the global crisis doesn't look very well, and that if we continue doing what we have been doing, we might not survive as a species, and we might destroy some other forms of life. And the crisis has many dimensions. It has economic dimensions, it has diplomatic, political, military dimensions, ecological dimensions, and the remedies that have been used usually create more problems than they solve, and the reason for that is that they're using the same strategies, they're based on the same philosophy that created the crisis in the first place. So people in the transpersonal movement feel that there is just one common denominator to all these different symptoms of the global crisis, that it really reflects somehow the level of consciousness evolution of the human species, and that radical change is really not possible unless there's some kind of deep sort of inner transformation of large numbers of people. And so transpersonal psychology seems to offer some insights into the psychospiritual roots of this crisis, and we believe that it also offers some remedies.
How interesting. And we are also undergoing a problem of violence, no? And excessive greed for things, and yeah, I know you've worked a lot on violence and its roots, and could you tell us something about that?
Well, I think there are two forces in the human nature that are particularly problematic, particularly dangerous, and in a sense they have always been. One of them is the propensity or the tendency to violence, and the other one is a tendency toward greed that seems to be insatiable. The feeling that there is never enough. There's never enough possessions, never enough money, fame, power, and so on. And very wrong sort of belief that somehow if we get more of these things, that it's going to bring inner peace, that it's going to bring happiness. And it seems to be basically a loser strategy. Whether we are getting those things or don't doesn't make much difference in how we feel. Once we get beyond a certain limit, beyond the survival limit, it certainly makes a difference in Ethiopia if there is a famine, where it's a problem of getting your meal or not having a place to stay. But once we get to the kind of level where many people in the Euro-American civilizations live, then just accumulation of material possessions or power or status doesn't really change very much. And so there's belief in the transpersonal movement that we would have to do something about these two forces. They have always been problematic, but in the 20th century they became really very, very dangerous. And the reason for that is that we have overpopulation, and we have development of weapons of mass destruction. So violence really threatens survival of life, and so does the greed, because it leads to plundering of non-renewable resources, fossil fuels and so on, and turning them into pollution. And so far it was only the first world countries that were doing it, but now it's being exported to China and India and Africa to countries with tremendous population, and I think it's a very dangerous trend.
Do you think you talked before about the roots of violence and how perhaps you associated it with some processes or in birth or in early childhood?
Yes, I could say that consciousness research like the one I have done that offers some really new insights into where these forces are coming from, both violence and greed. And they also offer us, new methods how we can confront them. And I believe that if properly used, that they could really help to alleviate somehow because not in and of themselves, but in connection with all the other things that we would be doing. So violence is usually interpreted in traditional medicine, biology, psychology as either something that's coming from our biological nature, or that is something that's result of frustrations, traumas that happened to us after we were born, during infancy, during childhood. So in the first category of these theories is the idea that we come from the animal kingdom, and of course aggression is very, very dominant in nature, and then it simply reflects our animal origin. So we have all these different theories, books like The Naked Ape, or MacLean's idea that we have three brains, the reptilian, primitive brain, and the mammalian brain, and then the neocortex, or the sociobiologists have the idea of the selfish gene, people like Richard Dawkins. But of course there's a problem with this kind of explanation, because there's no parallel to human aggression in the animal kingdom. The animals fight for food, they fight for sexual competition, or maybe defending their territory, but there's no parallel to something like Nazism, things that were happening in Auschwitz, or what Solzhenitsyn called the Gulag Archipelago, the things that were happening under the communist regime, or the things that the Chinese did in Tibet, or even here in South America, the military tortures, the military regime, and so on. So it's really not an adequate explanation. So the psychodynamic theories focus on the traumas from infancy and childhood. So for example, Erich Fromm wrote a book, Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, and there he distinguishes natural aggression, which is the one that you find in the animal kingdom, and then he talks about malignant aggression. The human aggression is malignant, and then he links it to postnatal traumas. You see that there were sort of frustrations, there were traumas, there were abuses, and that somehow amplified the inborn tendency to aggression, which we carry because of our origin from the animal kingdom. Now, the work that we have done with non-ordinary states of consciousness that really provide access to very deep levels of the psyche, they revealed two additional sources, two additional roots of aggression. We found out that there's a tremendous amount of aggression that comes from what we call now the perinatal domain, which is a deep level in the psyche that somehow reflects the trauma of birth. So if you look at what's happening to a child who's being born, the child is experiencing a life-threatening or potentially life-threatening, or in any case a very uncomfortable situation, sometimes for hours. There is a range of the duration of delivery from less than an hour to 30, 40, 50 hours, several days. A very, very painful, very challenging, very frightening situation. And that generates tremendous amount of kind of biological fury, tremendous amount of very primitive anger. and there's no way of expressing it during birth, so that it's all recorded in the organism, and the little crying or acting out that happens after birth is really minimal. It's very trivial as compared to what would be necessary to process and integrate that kind of trauma. So we see, for example, in the breath work that we're doing, the holotropic breath work, and we used to see in psychedelic sessions enormous amount of aggression coming out as people were processing the trauma of birth. And then we found that there are even deeper roots of aggression in a domain of the psyche that we now call transpersonal. This has much in common with what Jung called the collective unconscious. In Freudian psychology, we have just the individual unconscious that more or less is a derivative of postnatal biography, things that happened in infancy, in childhood, and later in life, things that we couldn't accept, things that we have forgotten, things that we have repressed, and so on. Whereas Jung emphasized that there's also this vast area, which he called the collective unconscious, and he believed that it had two aspects: one, the historical, when there's a record of human history, and then the other one he called archetypal, which basically contains sort of mythological structures. This domain in the unconscious can create mythological images of deities or domains, mythological domains. And of course that archetypal world is dichotomized. I mean, if you look at mythologies, there are sort of light deities and there are dark deities. For example, in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, as you go through the experience of death, according to the Bardo Thodol, you first encounter light, and then you encounter the sort of blissful images of what's called the Dhyani Yoga, the Dhyani Buddhas. And then as you go deeper into the Bardo, the same deities show their shadow side, that's sort of the dark side. In a system like astrology, you know, you have Venus and you have Neptune and Jupiter, and then you have Mars and Pluto. And any kind of mythology that you look at is always dichotomized. It has the dark side and the light side.
The light side. Sorry,
and
I'd like to go a little bit back to where you explained the Bardo Thodol, because I believe it's something generally people try to read the book and they don't understand it, and it's difficult for nearly everyone to understand. I know you have a profound study of that theme and of the Bardo Thodol. Could you explain for the people again that transaction, no, when a person is dying, and how they meet the different deities?
Well, according to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which is called Bardo Thodol, when we die, we first see very, very extraordinary radiant light, which is called the primary clear light, or Dharmakaya. And then from there, we start seeing, as we go further through the intermediate state, Bardo is the intermediate state between incarnations for the Tibetans. So as we go deeper into the Bardo, this light then transforms into images of 5 deities that are called the Dhyani Buddhas. When we encounter this light, according to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it's an opportunity for instant liberation. If we are prepared for that and we can face the enormity, we can sort of be liberated from the cycle of death and rebirth. If that doesn't happen, then instead of the light, we start seeing archetypal beings, the 5 Dhyani Buddhas. And again, if we cannot tolerate that, we are sort of going deeper into the Bardo state, and then instead of 5 deities, then we start seeing a whole pantheon of blissful and then also wrathful, angry deities, and then in the further development, the Tibetan Book of the Dead describes judgment that we experience, and then the idea that we can be born into different realms or locus, like realm of the gods, realm of the angry, jealous gods, the asuras, or into the human realm, or into the animal realm, and the realm of the hungry ghosts, or pretas, or then there's also hell in this system. And then towards the end, coming through the whole Bardo, we supposedly face new incarnation, where we see our future parents making love, and we start actually having feelings that are similar to what Freud described as the Oedipal feelings, or some of his disciples called Electra feelings, when it is happening to a woman, which is feeling attracted to the parent of the opposite sex, and feeling aversion to the parent of the same sex, and then reincarnation happens. But in different stages of this journey through the Bardo, we have the opportunity for liberation.
It's interesting, and in that path, one should choose. You are choosing in some way when you encounter each deity, or you just go through.
Well, at each of those stages, if we are prepared, if we can sort of stand somehow the intensity of the experience, we can get liberated according to the Bardo of Thodol. But this possibility or this potential decreases as we go deeper and deeper. They actually describe then the final possibility, maybe just being able to choose a better womb. But but the incarnation is kind of a fait accompli.
It's already good. Okay, I'm asking you these questions because we generally know more about life than about death, but it's a moment we all are going to go through all the same, and people when are closer to death or have a terminal illness, they want to know more about what is going to happen to them. They need more information.
I have written a special book about this, which is called The Books of the Dead, which with a lot of pictures that compares the Tibetan Book of the Dead with the Egyptian Book of the Dead. I also found some interesting material about the Maya culture, about the Mayan underworld, the Mayan Book of the Dead, and some very interesting Aztec culture, where there is one special codex.
They have like the book, like the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and the Tibetan, very similar.
Similar. And then in Europe we had something called Ars Moriendi, the art of dying. So in the book that I wrote, all these texts are, compared and illustrated.
And they have a lot of similarities, surely, or did you find very
similarities and some differences?
And some differences.
And then in the book I compare it with what we have seen in working with consciousness, but then particularly what we have seen in a study of terminal cancer patients. We did psychedelic therapy with over 200 people dying of cancer.
Interesting.
Looking how mystical experiences induced by psychedelics can take away fear of death, pain in many instances, pain that didn't respond to narcotics, and also transform the experience of dying itself. That people are capable to let go, to accept death when it becomes inevitable.
To have less fear because they know in a certain way the kind of experience they are going to go through.
Yes.
That's quite important.
So if we go back to violence now, so in this work in consciousness research, you find there are these deeper roots, not just the biographical roots, but also perinatal, coming from birth, and then these deep transpersonal roots. And you can see people not only experiencing it, but in many instances they are able to portray those experiences. And it's very interesting that these the encounter with birth and the violence of birth has very specific symbolism associated with it. So, for example, many people would experience the kind of the attack of the contractions as being a vicious octopus, because the fetus is in an amniotic situation. It's basically a kind of an oceanic setting, and then the attack comes in that context, which is very much like being in the ocean and being attacked by the octopus. The freedom is taken away from you, and you're sort of constricted. But sometimes the prenatal state is also experienced as a state of cosmic freedom rather than oceanic freedom, and there the specific symbolic threat would be something like an octopus. If you imagine a butterfly or a fly that has this sort of spatial freedom, the spider web and the spider would be a specific danger. Sometimes people experience it as more like a boa constrictor. The boa constrictor can swallow the prey and look pregnant. It can also twist the body around and crush. So those are very powerful images. Or beginning of birth is frequently experienced as a maelstrom, as a whirlpool that is kind of sucking you in when the water breaks and so on. And what I found particularly fascinating, and I also sort of published the pictures illustrating it, was that if you look at political cartoons or posters from the time of war, where a country is in war with another country, or there is bloody revolution impending, when a certain group or a country portrays the other group or the other country as an enemy, they use exactly the same kind of images. So there are many political cartoons showing the enemy as a spider. And this is really cross-cultural, and Saddam Hussein has been portrayed that way. You find Soviet cartoons portraying the American capitalist in that way, and so on. In some other cartoons, the enemy or the critical element is portrayed as an octopus. Slobodan Milosevic or Tsarist Russia threatening Europe, or Japan threatening Dutch Indonesia. Very, very fascinating. Or actually, there was one picture in which this person in a psychedelic session portrayed the birth as attack by predatory birds, and himself is kind of hanging like a fetus on the umbilical cord, and you can just juxtapose it with a cartoon showing the crisis in Salvador. So we can really, illustrate somehow the connection between birth and violence. And then, of course, if you go to the deeper roots, you can go to Hitler, who was very much using archetypal images. For example, the swastika, the solar eagle. He was talking about the 1,000-year Reich. Also, some of the Muslim leaders are using this basically a religious image of the war against the infidel, the jihad, to ignite somehow the anger of their followers, and use it for political reasons. Now, like the violence, the greed also has much deeper roots than just the postnatal or the biological roots. For Freud, of course, the greed was an oral phenomenon. The basic idea was that if we don't get enough oral satisfaction as infants, then it gets later in life sublimated, that we have sort of this tendency to get all for ourselves, to kind of incorporate, swallow everything. If it was something related to money, then it's seen as anal phenomenon in psychoanalysis, this sort of connection between feces and gold and money and so on. If it involved some kind of insatiable sexual appetite, that would be seen as phallic fixation. Now, if you work with non-ordinary states of consciousness, again, there is a deeper root for this insatiable greed connected to birth in a very interesting way. It shows that we all carry somehow the record, the memory of birth, of the struggle through the birth canal. We were born anatomically, but we have not really completed fully emotionally. It's kind of an incomplete gestalt in our unconscious. And if that imprint is close to the surface, it makes us feel uncomfortable, like the current situation is not okay. The way we are now is not okay, in the same way in which a fetus stuck in the birth canal does not feel good. So the idea is the solution is somewhere in the future. You have to get out, you have to get to another situation, and then in everyday life, in an adult, it gets projected into various goals. You know, what do I have to achieve? Where do I have to get to feel really comfortable? And if you look at it, they are all surrogates for this experience of getting out of an unpleasant situation to a better situation in the future. The existential philosophers called it auto-projecting. You know, I don't feel comfortable. Self-projecting.
Self-projection.
What do I have to do to feel more comfortable? And then for some people, it's, you know, money, $100,000. If I had $100,000, I would feel wonderful. For somebody else, it's a political goal. I have to be a senator, and then I will feel wonderful. For somebody, it could be medical diploma. You know, if I were a doctor, I would feel much better. And it creates a kind of a linear trajectory, a pursuit of something in the future, aiming always for something in the future, not living in the present, always living in a fantasy about how great it's going to be when we achieve something. And the interesting thing is that if we don't get there, we continue feeling unhappy, but we believe that we are unhappy because we didn't achieve the goal that would correct it. And then the other thing that can happen is that we achieve it and we wake up in the morning with $100,000 and nothing has really changed. And this might have happened, you know, many times in our life, that we expected some fantastic results from something and it didn't come, and we somehow don't learn. We don't say, this is a strategy that doesn't work. I have to really try something radically different. We usually say either the goal was not ambitious enough, you know, $200,000 would do that, or it wasn't the right goal. Maybe, you know, maybe I need to try something else. So we sort of are driven on a kind of linear trajectory through life and not really enjoying what we are, even if we are succeeding, not fully enjoying what we are getting, because the mind is kind of driving us always to something else. So it's a sense of kind of a chronic dissatisfaction.
And how can you stop that mechanism? No?
Well, some of my clients talked about it's like a rat race, or it's a treadmill, like when you have a hamster.
Say always on the round.
Always sort of running and not getting anywhere. So on this level, you can really mitigate that by completing the experience of birth. In a non-ordinary state, you can relive your birth, you can bring it fully into consciousness, so your state of being is more colored by what it is like to be out of the birth canal rather than being trapped in the birth canal. But that's not the deepest root. The deepest root of this greed seems to be transpersonal. And I can best describe it by referring to a book by Ken Wilber, which is called the Atman Project, where he basically talks about perennial philosophy, where there is the idea that our true nature is not the physical body and the ego, or what Alan Watts called the skin-encapsulated ego, but that our true nature is divine. Like in Hinduism, we are not nama rupa, we are not name and form, we are Atman Brahman. Sort of our true nature is divine. We are sort of ultimately identical or commensurate with the totality of the creative energy in the universe. So what he says in this book is that, you know, our true nature is divine, and that we never completely lose the awareness of that. We lose it to a great degree. We identify with the physical body and with our physical existence, but something within us sort of knows that we are more, or should be more, and because we don't know what we are seeking, we are trying to accomplish it through the limitations of the physical body and the material world. But we would somehow have to have it all, or be it all, to really live up to our true nature. See, because in a sense, if you are identical with Brahman, then the world is identical with Brahman, so we would have to be the whole world, or own the whole world. I have in my previous book, the Cosmic Game, a story about Alexander the Great, who came as close to divinity as you can. He was even called the divine Alexander, and this incredible military expedition where he took all the territories from Macedonia to India. And the story is that he came to India and he heard about a yogi who had the ability to see the future. So he went to him, and the yogi was sitting in meditation, and he interrupted him very brutally. He says, "I'm Alexander the Great. I understand you can see the future." And the yogi just sort of barely nodded. And so he says, "Well, can you tell me if my conquest of India will be successful?" Now he has appetite for a whole subcontinent. And so the yogi continues to meditate and sort of opens one eye and says, "All you will ultimately need is about 6 feet of ground." You know, and that's the human tragedy. That, you know, we cannot achieve somehow this the goal of that ambition. It's enormous, and so the only way this can happen is to go inside and, in a non-ordinary state, experience our own divinity. You can experience yourself as the divine. I mean, this is one of the possible transpersonal experiences. It happens in spiritual practice and in many other situations. We see it in the breath work. We used to see it when we were doing psychedelic work. So that's the only thing that can really come close to satisfying that kind of a drive that we have. So,
and that makes you understand, no? Perhaps the personal, when you reach a personal connection, you will understand more who you are, what it, your true self. That would
very
calm.
much so, yes. So then now it's interesting, I mean, what does transpersonal psychology have to offer, as remedy, as way of addressing these problems? This is just a diagnosis, which is very, in a sense, pessimistic, because it says the roots are much deeper than we thought. But there are also very, very powerful remedies that somehow transpersonal psychology offers. One of them would be dealing with violence. Another one would be dealing with the insatiable greed. But then another important element would be developing a different kind of worldview, different hierarchy of values that would make it possible for us to live individually in a more satisfying way, and also create a world that would be safer. When I discuss it, I usually use a famous Tibetan tanka, which is a kind of a scroll painting, and it shows the Lord of Death who holds in a very firm grip a wheel of life, And the wheel has 6 segments, which are the locus. I already referred to them. The realm of gods, the jealous gods, the beasts, the humans, the pretas, the hungry ghosts, and the realm of hell. And then in the middle are 3 animals, and that's a snake, a rooster, and a pig. And these 3 animals, according to Mahayana Buddhism, which Tibetan Buddhism, Vajrayana is one school of so-called Mahayana Buddhism, which is called the greater vehicle. Hinayana, the smaller vehicle, was the original teaching of the Buddha. Mahayana is something that developed out of it. In Hinayana, the original idea that Buddha had was that life is suffering. Being incarnate is suffering, and the tendency there was to leave somehow the material domain altogether. The term nirvana meant escape from the realm of incarnation. Nirvana means evanescence. It's related to wind, sort of the blowing of the torches of life and so on. Where the idea was this was, the valley of tears. This was the quagmire of death and rebirth and so on, the source of suffering. Now, when Mahayana then developed later, the idea was different, and that was that the source of suffering are these 3 forces that Tibetan Buddhism calls the poisons, the 3 poisons of Tibetan Buddhism, and those are represented by the 3 animals, where the snake represents anger, aggression, the pig represents ignorance, and the rooster represents lust, desire, and attachment to material things. And in Mahayana Buddhism, the idea is that you can reach actually nirvana or different degrees of this nirvanic state to the extent to which you can eliminate the impact of those 3 forces in your life. You can free yourself from ignorance, from aggression, and from greed, from lust, from desire. Now, the work with non-ordinary states actually offers ways of addressing all those 3 forces and dealing with them in your life. So, for example, if you look at the ignorance represented by the snake, in non-ordinary states you can get profound insight into your life. You can find out how your problems are related to what happened to you in childhood, in infancy, the degree to which you are still programmed by your own birth or even prenatal events. You can also have experiences of different aspects of nature and get new information about various life forms, different aspects of the universe. So you can get a lot of new information in these non-ordinary states, but that is really not what the snake represents. Ultimately, the snake represents what's called in Buddhism avidya, ignorance, but ignorance of kind of transcendental proportions, ignorance about the nature of reality, ignorance about your own nature. And so the remedy against it is called prajna paramita, which means transcendental wisdom. And so the different types of experiences which are of a spiritual nature can really provide this transcendental wisdom in non-ordinary states. Then if you look at the second animal, which is the snake, we already talked about it. You can relive different traumatic experiences from childhood that are associated with a lot of aggression or a lot of anger. You can express that aggression with help of others and free yourself from that aggression. You can relive your birth and free yourself from the amount of biological fury and anger that's related to the trauma of birth. And then you can also free yourself from some of the anger that's karmic in nature. You can relive past life memories, and those are a source of a lot of anger. You can also allow some of the dark archetypes to fully manifest, and you can sort of transform that energy. You can integrate it. So people typically become much less aggressive, much more peaceful, much more tolerant, much more understanding, and so on. And then we have this third, which is the third animal, which is the greed, the insatiable greed, the attachment, the lust, the desire. So again, there's some sources in childhood. Let's say, Freud talks about the frustrations, oral frustrations, and so on. Again, you can go back there and you can heal those biographical sources of greed. But then there's this deeper component that comes from birth, which will be eliminated when you complete the memory of birth. That you connect more to the prenatal or the postnatal frame of mind than the experience of being stuck and struggling, being involved sort of in life, so that you're constantly fighting and trying to get somewhere else. And then in terms of the deepest sources of greed, you can actually have this experience of identification with the divine, and realize your own divinity, and then with that awareness of your own divinity, you then return to your everyday life, but you see your present life as a role that you're playing, not as all you have or all you are. So life becomes sort of much easier, much more relaxed, because you have this larger meta framework. So if people could experience this individually, it would improve their individual life, the way they are in the world. But if a number of people could do it, then it would certainly change the situation in the world. I mean, if we had less violence, if we had less greed, less competition, more sense of cooperation, tolerance, and so on. So this is somehow the transpersonal vision.
Very important.
Now, obviously, we have to do all kinds of other things. We have to translate this into practical programs and interventions and so on. But the basic idea here is that the interventions would have to be coming from a different awareness, from a different state of consciousness, and that would require somehow that we start changing the world by beginning with ourselves, rather than feeling we are already okay and there's something outside, that should change.